Okay, folks, we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the final 2023 Global Economic Governance Initiative new book series talks. We've had a set of wonderful talks this year, held and sponsored by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center, as we like to call ourselves. The GDP Center advances policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And one of our signature programs is called the Global Economic Governance Initiative, or GEGI, and we've been sponsoring this book series. My name is Kevin Gallagher, and I'm the inaugural director. We're really excited to have Eric Heliner here with us from Canada, and let me give you some context before I introduce him. At present, the global economy is perhaps the most contested, at its most contested point in the century. In the advanced economies, economists and politicians contest the extent to which central bankers should engage in more contractionary or expansionary policy, whether industrial policy or free trade is the right way to move our economy, whether we need to have carbon taxes or investment-led approaches to dealing with climate change, or maybe there's no such thing as climate change and we shouldn't do anything about it at all. The impact of high interest rates on debt levels in the developing world, and the need for the advanced economies to pay for the loss and damage that they've occurred in developing world because of their inaction on climate change. Last week, the Pardee School was inducted into the Association of Professional Schools and International. Marxism is another sort of third strand. But this book is an instant classic global history of ideas and global political economy. It's essential not only to have a full understanding of the history, to get your history right, but it's essential to be able to have a toolkit of ideas to try to solve these problems that are so contested in the world economy right now. So it's great to have Eric Heliner back here at the GDP Center and the Pardee School. He was actually present at the creation of the GDP Center. He was here at our very first event. And I remember, Rishi, you were too. Our very first event was before we moved in to 53 Bay State Road. We had a special conference on Southern-led or Global South-led international financial institutions. And you gave a great paper there on Sun Yat-sen, who you talk about in both of these books. That turned into the first product that the GDP Center ever did. It was a special issue of the journal Development and Trade. So it's great to have you back here. He's a professor at and university research chair in the Department of Political Science at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, also just inducted into APSIA recently at the University of Waterloo. Since he received his PhD from the London School of Economics, I won't say the year, you put it in your bio, he has published widely in the field of international political economy, including 7 single-authored books. My favorites that I constantly teach from are your first one, States and the Emergence of Global Finance, which was the first to trace how central bankers, private capital markets, and economic ideas played a role in shifting global political economy from embedded liberalism to what became known as neoliberalism. And then another favorite is the Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods, which revealed the important contributions that countries from the global South had in the formation of the global architecture that came out of the Bretton Woods meeting. It was not just Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes by any stretch of the imagination. I already waved this one, the Neo-Mercantilist. This came out last year. Somehow this guy wrote 800 pages in 2 years. This one's really important for understanding the thinking behind industrial policy and the way to think about national-led economic strategies. It's not just Frederick List. There's a long list, sorry for the bad dad joke, of folks that one would need to really understand. He's a fellow at the Royal Society of Canada and co-editor of the book series Cornell Studies in Money, which Professor Grimes has published in, and so have I. He received the 2020 IPE Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Studies Association, and his past books have won the Donner Prize, the CPSA Prize in International Relations. Let me see if I can get this one right, and the Francesco Guicciardini Prize for Best Book in Historical International Relations. Before I pass it over to Professor Heliner, I want to mention that this event is hybrid. So we'll also have an audience on Zoom. The webinar is also being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible. And for those of you who have friends here who didn't want to come during the rain, they can go watch it on YouTube after this. So for you folks in our virtual audience, really glad to have you here. In the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom, there's a Q&A box. Please put your name and your affiliation, and please ask a question. And during the Q&A, not only will we have a conversation with the people here in the room, but we'll engage with you. So first, we're going to start with having Eric do a brief introduction of his book. Then I'll ask a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you in the room and all of you out there, wherever you are. So please, for those of us who are here, help me in welcoming Eric Heliner from the University of Waterloo.
So thanks so much, Kevin. That's a really wonderful introduction, a little bit intimidating introduction, but it's great to be here. I was saying to Kevin before that I'm a huge fan of what Kevin Center is doing. I mean, I'm on the mailing list, and it's always the one email that I do read. I get a lot of emails, and that's the one that I always look at. It's fantastic work, both policy-oriented, but I think also the context that you're providing for global economic policy discussions everywhere. So all of you who are here, you're lucky to be here, and those of us who get to drop in every now and then, we're really delighted whenever we get that opportunity. So I'm also really grateful for Kevin for inviting me. This is a book I've actually worked on, I'm embarrassed to say, for 8 years, which is a long time for a political scientist. You know, some of you might be historians, and they think that's a normal time to write a book. But political scientists usually write books more quickly than that, and this one took quite a long time. It's also a little bit embarrassing because I thought I would write it in about 2 years or so. Like I thought it'd be a really quick thing. And what my goal essentially was to provide for students a book which told the deep history of thought about the world economy. And you know, if you go into an international relations course, or say an economics course, or political theory course, they have many, many books that tell the 200-300 year history of their field, history of thought. And the field of international political economy has not had that. We have a great book that Jerry Cohen wrote that Kevin referenced, which is a history of the field since 1970. But all of the people, the Kindlebergers, the Susan Stranges, the Jerry Cohens who pioneered the field in the 1970s, all said that they were resurrecting a tradition that existed before 1945. And so I would always tell that to students, and students say, well, where can we read about that pre-1945 history? The Adam Smiths, the Lists, all these people. And we didn't really have a succinct version. And so I, you know, truth be told, I hoped someone else would write this book. Nobody else did. And so I thought, okay, I guess maybe it's a stage of career thing that you're supposed to do these sorts of books. And so I started into a thing I'll do really quickly. What became very clear to me quickly is that I had two frustrations with the way this history was being told in our textbooks. So one of them, as Kevin has said, is that the depiction of the pre-1945 history is that there's three perspectives. So there's economic liberalism, there's a kind of neo-mercantilist tradition, and there's a Marxist tradition, which is usually, I should say, not so much associated with Marx himself, but with the Marxist theories of imperialism from the late 19th, early 20th century, Lenin, Luxemburg, people like that. And so there are two problems with that, which I knew immediately from my own work. One is that it portrays the world as if only European, or in the case of Alexander Hamilton is often mentioned, American thinkers thought about the world economy before 1945. And that's simply not true. There are fantastic ideas in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and yet we give them no prominence in the way the textbooks tell the history of the field. It's told in a very Eurocentric or Western-centric way. But the second problem is that the debate in almost every region that I knew and different contexts that I knew was very different than just a three-way debate. There were all kinds of other perspectives that were involved in debates about the world economy, which are not being represented. And interestingly, a lot of those perspectives are ones that are particularly relevant to the current period. So I'll just flag right away a couple of them. Environmental thought was very prominent in the pre-1945 period, despite the fact that we portray it as a kind of a modern, since the 1960s. Feminist thought, interestingly, was very prominent in the pre-1945 period in thinking about the world economy. Some of the Chinese conceptions of tributary relations that are being resurrected right now have their origins in the pre-1945 period. Many different perspectives that have prominence today have their roots in this earlier period, and students, I think, would benefit from understanding the roots, what those roots are. Okay, so that's the motivation. I thought I knew this history. It turned out I didn't know it nearly as well as I should have. And so that's why it took 8 years. And so let me just give you a couple of examples of things that I learned that I probably should have known, but that I didn't. And I was joking with Kevin that I got more and more angry in the sense that my own education, things that I was not taught that I thought I should have been when I read more widely than I'd been able to before. Okay, so the book's divided in two halves. One half is essentially saying, can we tell the story of the three, I call them the three orthodoxies, liberalism, neo-mercantilism, and Marxism, from a standpoint which is more global. So instead of saying these are all European or sometimes American thinkers, can we tell the story of those three perspectives in a more global way? And what I found very quickly is that that's very easy to do. And what you find if you take a more global perspective is that there are three contributions that are being made by scholars outside Europe and the United States in the context of these three ideologies, which we consider to be very prominent in the field. Let me just tell you what those three were. One is that there are often thinkers outside of Europe or outside the United States who read, say, Adam Smith, or read a Marxist theories of imperialism from Europe, and then modified it in ways that were often quite interesting. And those modifications are really significant intellectual contributions. So to give you an example, when Latin American thinkers read Adam Smith, they thought, oh, it's very interesting, the free trade message. But in the context of Peru or in the context of Colombia in the 19th century, we may want to have free trade at the border, but to maximize the benefits of free trade, we're going to have an activist state domestically, which is not Adam Smith's message. And so it's a kind of a modification of the European idea. The same goes on with neo-mercantilist thought, where a lot of people read Frederick List around the world. But the part they found really frustrating in Frederick List was that he's an incredibly Eurocentric thinker who thought most of the world should never industrialize, that it was destined to be a commodity exporters. And he thought that, in fact, of all tropical areas of the world. And so if you're living in Africa or you're living in Asia and you read this part of List, you react against it, because your whole point is you're trying to read List to learn how to industrialize through state-led industrialization. So many critiques of List made from outside of Europe on that basis. Similarly with Marxist theories of imperialism, where a lot of people would read Lenin's work on imperialism and say, where's the impact of imperialism on colonized people? And so many thinkers in Latin America or Asia or Africa are analyzing the impact of imperialism rather than its causes, the European causes. So I go through a lot of those examples in the book. Second contribution, and this is a particularly interesting one, is that there are many thinkers in other parts of the world who came up with very similar ideas as European or American thinkers, but independently, with no engagement with European or American thinkers. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples here. In the context of China in the 18th century, there's a famous administrator called Chang Hongmu who is developing ideas about the ways in which markets generate public good in a kind of Smithian way. He's never read Smith. He's not familiar with any European proto-liberal ideas at that time. He also has ideas about free trade, which, I'm writing a book about the history of IPE. I was fascinated to read that he thought free trade would generate mutual benefits, that it would generate peace, and then it would spread civilization. Same arguments being made in Europe, but being developed independently by a Chinese thinker who was a contemporary of Adam Smith. So that'd be one example. There's other examples are in the neo-mercantilist camp, where the Japanese, and I think this is a really misunderstood story in Western scholarship, that we often tell that the Meiji experience in late 19th century Japan, this great success story of state-led industrialization, is often told as a story where the Japanese read List and applied it. But in fact, they had their own endogenous tradition of neo-mercantilist thought, which is where the key roots of the ideas come from. So the central Meiji administrator does not tell his staff to read List. He tells them to read a thinker from the 1830s in Japan who developed similar ideas, but developed independently of List. The same is true a little bit in the Marxist tradition when you get into theories of imperialism. I cite a Japanese thinker in 1901, 15 years before Lenin wrote his theory of imperialism, who developed very, very similar ideas, and yet is never taught by IPE scholars, but probably should be. Very, very interesting thinker. So that's the second contribution. The third one I just want to mention quickly, and this is really for my colleagues who, when I began this project, said, you're not going to really find anything that different when you go outside of Europe and America. There's only a certain number of ideas. Europeans, Americans came up with them. Maybe other people came up with similar ideas, but you're not going to find anything out of the box. What this third contribution is people outside of Europe and America who are influencing those same European American thinkers who are held up in such high esteem in textbooks. So to give you one example, Sun Yat-sen is, I think, my favorite example. A Chinese thinker, early 20th century, who developed what I think is the first proposal for a World Bank. He develops this in 1918 into 1919 into 1920. The proposal gets more and more elaborate. It's presented to the League of Nations. And so this isn't some obscure writer, very prominent figure in Chinese politics at the time, writing something which is being sent to the Paris Peace Conference and ends up being cited at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the World Bank is finally created. And so there's a diffusion, an idea coming from outside of Europe and America and having very significant influence. Okay, so that's what one part of the book does, is to try to say, can we at least tell the conventional story of the three perspectives in a way that's not so Western-centric? And I think you can, and I think the story is absolutely a fascinating one. The second part of the book says, okay, that's one thing we can do a little bit differently, but can we also recognize that the debate has always been much wider than a debate between liberals, neo-mercantilists, and Marxists? So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. The one school of thought which I think is strikingly absent from our textbooks is the autarkic tradition of thinking about the world economy. These are people who believe in national self-sufficiency and are essentially not taken seriously in our textbooks, I think for a fairly simple reason, which is that the whole post-war international economic order was against that idea. And there was kind of a rejection of the autarkic ideas of the 1930s, which were often associated with fascism. And so this discredited. And then not taken seriously after the war. When you look into the pre-1945 world, and this was, I have to say, a surprise to me, was the extent to which the autarkic strand of thought, which is sometimes right-wing, sometimes left-wing, like it's all over the place, was very prominent in debates around the world. And so I go through, and by the way, why do we need to take this seriously? Because we seem to be in a kind of deglobalizing moment where some people are resurrecting these ideas. And so students need to understand, where are these ideas coming from? So in the European tradition, it goes back to Fichte, major political theorist who writes a book about the closed commercial state right at the turn of the into the 1800s, paralleling through, to Keynes, who writes a famous piece in 1933 called The National Self-Sufficiency. So long tradition of thought. Outside of the West, many, many thinkers write about the benefits of autarkism. And they range from Gandhi, for example, who is a big defender of the idea of autarkism, not just a human rights campaigner, but he was very interested in economic ideas, through to, before Gandhi, to Japanese thinkers who were defending what was an autarkic strategy that Japan had for 200 years before Admiral Perry came in the 1850s and opened up the Japanese economy. And so if you go to different moments in the world economy, you find that strand prominent, and I think we need to understand it. And so the book goes through that. Some other examples I've already mentioned. I think a really important one for people to understand today is the tributary tradition, which is the way Chinese bureaucrats thought about the world economy before the first opium and second opium wars. And so it's not liberal, it's not neo-mercantilist, it's not Marxist, it's a different way of thinking about international economic relations. It's kind of managed trade relations in support of diplomatic goals, underpinned by a kind of moral foundation of Confucian logic, saying this is a more principled international economic order. So just to give you an example, when the British come in with their gunships in the first opium wars, there's a debate in China about how they should respond. And it's not a debate between liberals and Marxists and neo-mercantilists. It's a debate between defenders of the tributary tradition and some kind of proto-neo-mercantilist thinkers at that time. And those ideas are being resurrected. So Xi Jinping, for example, cites Sun Yat-sen's ideas, and Sun Yat-sen himself would often describe how when China became rich, it should resurrect this tributary tradition. And the very passages where he's saying that are passages very close to ones that Xi Jinping has cited at various times in the last 5 years. And so again, students need to understand that. Many students have never heard of Sun Yat-sen. They don't know that he was a political economist. And yet here we have major power in the world citing those ideas. Those ideas in turn have their roots in earlier 19th century thinking by Chinese. I've already mentioned two other examples. Environmental thought. I was actually quite struck by the extent to which political economists in the 19th century were interested in the relationship between the world economy and environmental degradation. So some of the most famous thinkers, in fact, had ideas about this. So Stanley Jevons is very worried about the relationship between free trade and kind of dwindling coal supplies in Europe. Henry Carey, major figure in the United States, is a critic of free trade because of its impact on soil degradation. He thinks monocrop agriculture is destroying the soils of America. There are Japanese thinkers around the time of the Meiji Restoration, when Japan is being opened up, who say the opening of Japan will destroy forests. Again, they're concerned about soil. Some of them are even concerned about the dependence that will emerge on fossil fuels, like very amazing kind of ideas that are being developed. So I try to highlight the extent to which environmentalism should not be seen as a kind of a new idea coming out of the 60s or 70s, but rather something building on much deeper ideas. I already mentioned feminist thought. This is certainly true of pre-1945 period, where many feminists are writing extremely interesting things about the world economy. So let me just give you my favorite example, which is a Chinese thinker, one of the first Chinese feminist thinkers around 1907, 1908. What she's interested in is China's incorporation into the world economy from the mid-19th century on. And she says it was incredibly gendered in its impact, where there's a huge influx of textile imports into China, which are destroying household-based spinning and weaving, which is dominated by women. And those women were losing their jobs and being forced to work in big factories on the coast, which was in working conditions that were much poorer than the ones that they had in the household context. So fascinating, way in which linking international economic relations to changing gender relations within China. Just mention maybe a couple of other examples. You tell me when I need to.
I've been trying to signal to you for a couple.
Okay. I'll mention one more example, which is ideas around the racialized nature of the world economy. We've got a chapter looking at the Pan-African movement, and the Pan-African movement was very interested in how the world economy was racialized. So these are figures like Marcus Garvey or figures like W.B. Du Bois, who are writing very sophisticated ideas about how theories of imperialism need to be linked to racialized ideas of imperialism. So all of that is to say, the debates about the world economy that we're having today, some of which we say are new, suddenly we're talking about gender or environment or racial issues or tributary conceptions or deglobalization. We can find the roots of these in pre-1945 thought. So just as Susan Strange or Kindleberger or Robert Gilpin or these people said they were resurrecting, a pre-1945 tradition, we can do the same, that there's huge lineages of these ideas in this earlier period. So let me just finish by saying the case for doing this, I think, is twofold. One is to understand our history better, and I'm fine with that being the only rationale. But if you're a more pragmatic person, there's also some, I think, two really pragmatic reasons. One is we should not be reinventing the wheel. Many of these ideas have been thought about before, and we can find inspiration in them. But I think the really pragmatic one is that students should understand when Modi talks about, Swadeshi economics, what does that mean? Well, you have to understand the history in late 19th century, early 20th century Indian economic thought. When Xi Jinping invokes Sun Yat-sen, students need to understand what Sun Yat-sen's ideas were. When Latin American thinkers talk about Mariátegui, who was this figure? Central figure in Marxist thought in the interwar period. At the moment, we're not giving our students that foundation. We're just telling them about these European thinkers of three traditions. And I think the history needs to be wider in order that students understand the contemporary references that are being made, both by scholars, but even by these major political figures. So I'm sorry I've gone on too long, but I hope that's helpful.
No, great, great stuff. Now, this is a great book, and I love how you talk about three different things. Right. So on one level, we have these three different traditions that did diffuse globally, which we didn't quite understand, but they're manifest in different places in different ways. Like the Pan-Africanist, you didn't talk about it too much, but he's got a whole chapter in there. They're thinking about Marx, but in a very different way than the working class is in Europe. They're interpreting imperialism in the way that it's impacting the region and how they might respond. And another way is that, well, because we all learned it through these three lenses, you go to Japan and you think, oh, they're just doing what Liszt did. And then so therefore we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what history was, because we're basically just, projecting what we see and thinking that that's the way that the world is working around, which is dangerous, which is another real important reason to read this book. But what I wanted, you mentioned one, the book also outlines thinkers that came up with stuff that we think we did here in the West that we didn't, like Sun Yat-sen came up with the first idea of a development bank, of an international development bank. So what are some other examples in the book of like organic ideas and frames for the world that came from the global South that we really need to understand in this book?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples, and it kind of depends on what your own interests are. So, for example, if you're an environmentalist and you're interested in debates about the North's kind of imperial ways of living, the way the North is living beyond its means, essentially. There's an Indian thinker in the 1930s, Mukherjee, who develops these ideas in a very sophisticated way, well before this becomes prominent in Western scholarship in the 1980s and 90s. If you're kind of neo-mercantilist who's interested in, state-led industrial policy, there's really innovative ideas being developed in Japan as one example, but also in China in the mid-19th century in the kind of self-strengthening movement, which again was not informed by engagement with Liszt or engagement with Alexander Hamilton or other European thinkers. And those ideas in the East Asian context are often slightly different, like the larger state role, more export-oriented. Some of the things that became very prominent in the East Asian development model are there from the mid-19th century onwards. Other examples, one of my favorite examples in terms of a figure who's influencing debates in the West is a figure named Nauroji, who's an Indian thinker, very significant figure in the Indian nationalist movement in the late 19th century. And he developed something called the drain theory, which is essentially looking at British colonialism in India and saying the impact of imperialism is to drain resources out of South Asia. And he shows it in a very detailed statistical way. And it becomes one of the first very sophisticated critiques of imperialism from the standpoint of someone who was colonized. And that theory is being read by European thinkers, both liberal and Marxist critics of imperialism, but even across the Atlantic in American anti-imperialist circles at the turn of the century. Now, Nauroji's a major figure. They're all understanding the kind of critique he made statistically of, what the impact of imperialism was. So just to give you an example of that, like Nauroji attends one European conference, and is given a standing ovation for his kind of critique of imperialism. And yet Nauroji is never told, in our kind of accounts of theories of imperialism at the moment, but at the time was a major figure.
Great. I'm going to ask him maybe 1.5 more questions. So get ready to ask some questions yourself and you folks out there on the other side of the camera. One thing I just want to, I could tell from the book, but I want to make sure you clarify, because often when we're taught about Smith and Marshall, that's seen as a counter to the world of mercantilism. And you talk here about neo-mercantilism, and you say that's distinct from autarky, and people think about autarky. So what is the difference? This brings your last book in a little bit more, but what's the difference between autarky and mercantilism or neo-mercantilism?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked me that, because in the field of IPE, and I think more generally, these ideas are sometimes given a broad name of economic nationalism, which includes often two quite distinct ideas. A neo-mercantilist, or a mercantilist before them, is someone who believes in state-led industrialization within an open world economy. They're trying to improve the position of the power and wealth of their state, but within an integrated system. And so that was List, and that was Hamilton, and that was the Colberts before the mercantilists. And maybe just to say very quickly there, a neo-mercantilist is different than a mercantilist, because a neo-mercantilist has read Smith, knows Smith's critique of mercantilism, and says, I still believe this stuff. And so they're kind of reinforcing the mercantilism of the early era with the informed understanding of Smith's critique of it. An autarkist is someone who doesn't want an open world economy. They want to insulate themselves from that. And they're not necessarily someone who believes in maximizing the power and wealth of their state either. They're just someone who wants autonomy. Sometimes it's economic autonomy, sometimes it's political autonomy, but sometimes in the Japanese case, it's cultural autonomy from the impacts that economic relations might bring in terms of cultural influences. And so autonomy is the goal of an autarkist, as opposed to a mercantilist or neo-mercantilist who's trying to, maximize the power and wealth of their system within an integrated world economy. So to put it in contemporary terms, I would say, the Biden administration is neo-mercantilist in its pursuit of a state-led kind of industrial policy. Whereas, if they were suddenly determined to say, we're going to, put huge barriers up and stop all trade with the rest of the world, that would be an autarkic strategy.
Yeah, 100% decoupling would be.
Yes, decoupling,
autarky.
exactly. Yeah.
One more small one. You've got he's got a whole chapter here, a whole discussion of Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism. Where's Raoul Prebisch and those folks? They were writing before 1945. They don't become a global movement until after that. Is that why they're not here? I'm really surprised that whole strand, which perhaps at least in the 20th century had the biggest political momentum, isn't here.
Right. So you're not the first person to ask me that, because I've written elsewhere about Raoul Prebisch's ideas. So the reason Raoul Prebisch isn't in the book is Prebisch, so he's a central banker in the 1930s. He leaves his role in the central bank in 1943 because of the political difficulties in Argentina. And he begins to develop his core periphery ideas in 1944. Like that's the first kind of origins of it.
Squeaks right in.
And he's right at the end of the period
All right.
that I have. Okay. But interestingly, I do think the structuralist tradition that he, is really pioneering, built on another thinker that I do describe quite a bit, which is Aya de la Torre, a Peruvian, who develops, like Albert Hirschman wrote a really nice piece about the origins of Latin American development thinking. And he argues that Aya de la Torre, who's a writer in the 1920s and 30s, really set the groundwork for all of that later structural stuff. So I feature Aya as opposed to Prebisch, because Prebisch is really developing the ideas just at the very end of the period that I'm interested in.
Great. Well, I hope that's all this has gotten you folks thinking, both here in the room and out there. If I could take this to take some from out there. Please raise your hand. We'll take 2 or 3 questions. Please tell us your name and where you're from, so Eric can get to know who you are and we can have a global conversation. And I'll pull some off online as well. So let's have some hands. Everyone's always shy to be the first one.
I have an easy one. So
who are you?
Oh, right. Yes. Hi, my name is Pravina, and I'm a pre-doctoral research fellow at the GDP Center. Like I said, really easy, but I'm really fascinated as to how you sourced your material. Do you speak all these languages, or did you use English? Do you think that would have biased your reading of it? Just really curious to know how that worked.
Let me take a couple. Behind her, right here.
Hi, Professor Eric. Thank you so much for your talk. This is so fascinating. And I was really curious and about when you talked about the Chinese feminist thinkers and the feminist thought, because my dissertation studies the gender consequences on the labor market after the China's one-child policy. So I've been thinking about the changing role of women's performance on the labor market as well as family planning, because it's so closely related to a country's development. And also given the declining birth rates in so many countries across the world right now, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks. Why don't I take one from online? We'll let Professor Heliner answer this, and then we can do another round. So start thinking about the next round. So this one is from Ajith Raj. He's a PhD student in the Transdisciplinary Sustainability Program up your way at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, or closer to you than Boston. He said, could you shed some light, a little bit more light, on the history of economic governance, especially from schools of thoughts out of classical Western traditions that we can get inspired by to think to think better in terms of sustainable development, climate change, and economic governance as we go ahead. Does that make sense? Why don't you take those and we'll do another round.
Yeah, so those are all great questions. Let me just begin with the methods question, because it's a really important question. And if I'm normally giving a longer talk, I explain the methods. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to do that. So this is a project where I essentially use partners, especially in the early part of it, because partly for linguistic reasons, but also because my expertise in many of these regions is low. And so I was partnering with scholars who had expertise in different areas, and we would co-author. And so that was kind of the origins of the project. What also became clear to me, though, is that this project, I think, would have been very difficult to do 20 years ago, but the kind of global intellectual history movement has been extremely useful for someone doing what I'm trying to do, because the translations now that have appeared in English for someone like me are much more extensive than they were 20 years ago. So I can read Japanese texts that have been translated, in a way that I couldn't 20 years ago. So that was very, very useful. But the main, I like to read primary texts. And so there were a number of primary texts I could not read. I couldn't find a partner to help me read them, and I couldn't find translations. And so there I'm relying on secondary literature, which to me is very frustrating, because when you read primary texts, you often see things that other people don't see because they're not looking for what you're looking for. And so that's it's a huge limitation in certain parts of the book that I would love one day to be able to rectify. So I'll just give you one example of this. There's a Chinese thinker, Zheng Guanying, who does some of the most interesting work in the last third of the 19th century. He's a key figure of the self-strengthening movement. And he has this work that comes out in the 1890s, which I would love to read, and I have not been able to read, but there is an English translation coming out. And so I'm just waiting to see that I miss things that I might have seen if I'd been able to read the primary. So anyway, that's a long way of saying there's huge holes in what I'm trying to do. It's kind of a first attempt, and I hope other people are correcting, whatever mistakes I've been made or misinterpretations. There are often, I think, holes that I've probably not filled very well. The question about gender is very interesting. I don't have a specific, insights on that. But what I do want to say is how interesting I think it is to see that feminist critiques of political economy go way, way back to early responses to Adam Smith. So there's a figure in the 1790s who's already critiquing Smith, for where are the women in the wealth of nations? And it's both the unpaid sector, the kind of, Smith's famous line about it's not from benevolence of the butcher, baker, brewer that we get our dinner. It's with regard to the self-interest. The question is, who made the dinner? The kind of unpaid economy. But also critiques about, Smith is talking about liberty, but isn't talking about the barriers to employment, barriers to education, that women were facing in his own Scottish environment, which was in fact one of the most patriarchal societies in Europe at the time. And so those, I was just fascinated to see those critiques are very, very early on. I was interested in the extent to which they then are linked to international economic relations, because that was what I was trying to look for. And that does come, like Harriet Martineau, who's a major liberal feminist thinker, is making those arguments by the mid-19th century, linking free trade to gender relations. But I think it's really in the early 20th century where those arguments get put up to the level of global economic governance in the context of the League of Nations discussions. And so I have some material about that. I think that's why the Chinese thinker is particularly interesting, though, because she's writing before that, like it's 1907, 1908, and she's developing this very sophisticated critique of the globe, kind of what we would call globalization in terms of micro household, dynamics. And so it's I just found it very sophisticated for its time. The last question about other ideas. Yeah, so
what's inspiring for sort of global environmental governance today that comes out of
right. Yeah, so this is a chapter which the chapter I call it environmentalist thought. Essentially says there were many different ways of thinking about the relationship between the environment and the global economy in the pre-1945 period. So some thinkers are liberal, and some thinkers are Marxist environmentalists, and some thinkers are neo-mercantilist environmentalists. But then there's also people who you can't classify into those schools. So, for example, I have a Lakotan thinker who's got a kind of indigenous perspective on the extent to which settler colonialism was undermining ecological conditions across North America. You can't fit that into a liberal, neo-mercantilist, or a Marxist perspective. Or Frederick Soddy, this fascinating fellow who wins a Nobel Prize in the 1920s, is interested in energy, the energy basis of human economies. And he's just very difficult to classify into traditional camps. And then I think there's some thinkers who we would probably describe today as Greens, kind of a commitment to economic localism, often degrowth kind of thinking, which is there very early on. I think Gandhi is in that tradition, and certainly many followers of Gandhi are in that tradition. So my answer to the person's question is it kind of depends what your own worldview is. I think there's many ways to approach environmental issues today, and there were in the pre-1945 period as well.
I think we have time for another round. Well, way in the back there, and then here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kiki Adozie. I'm a professor at UMass Boston. Thank you, Eric. A fascinating book. Can't wait to get my hands on it, especially the Pan-African economy chapter. But my question is, this fascinating history that you tell us, especially the alternative ideas history, how do we in the contemporary, especially global economic actors, use your fascinating knowledge to perhaps harmonize the conflicts in the contemporary global economy? I'm thinking about even sort of the Brexit, the sort of economic nationalism in the West, in the global South vis-a-vis, global North relations in terms of the stalemates in the WTO, the, stalemates in COPs. How do we use, the knowledge from your book to, resolve, some of these? I mean, the global economy is still contested, is what you're saying. We used to think it was harmonized by this Western thought. You've told us now that it actually has always been contested, and there have always been alternative ideas, but it's especially, contested in 2023 with hyper-globalization. And so, what do you think the knowledge in your book, can tell us about how to address some of those conflicts? Thank you.
One up here in the front.
Hi, Bill Grimes from Boston University. And you do a really interesting job of delineating the way that schools of thoughts develop over this. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit about distinctive mashups. So I'm thinking in particular of Japan. So if you look at the total war mobilization or the economic development in Manchuria, this is based partly on ideas of military first, but heavily Marxist. Half the people who are involved in the development of industrial policy in Manchuria were Marxists, and the other half were these sort of arch conservatives. And then coming into the post-war period, which I know we're not supposed to step into, but you have like people like Arisawa Hiromi they're kind of Marxist tinged liberal thinkers, and you end up with a very distinctive approach that at a time then in the 1950s when there's this idea in Eklas and others that you have ISI or you have the world economy that you're just going to get screwed by, and the Japanese essentially they ignore it, and they do industrial policy and many import substituting activities while nurturing a deep and selective involvement with the global economy. And so I just wonder if you can speak a little bit about the ways in which shoving ideas together in different places may have led to interesting synthesis.
One more in here before I take one offline. Hi.
Hey, hi, Professor Hellener. My name is Frank. I'm from China, and I have a question regarding. It might be an easy question for you, but like, what are your thoughts about like using 1955 as 1945 as a turning point for your book instead of writing something about pre-1945 events and history regarding economics? Because obviously, 1945 is such a important year for international relations, and many classes are using 1945 and pre and post 1945 in forming different curriculums. And I'm just wondering what are your personal thinking in terms of using that year as a in your book.
Great. Let me just take one here. We have Rebecca Ray, who's in Pennsylvania from the Global Development Policy Center. She says, thanks for a fascinating presentation and a clear call to action for IPE scholars to broaden our horizons. How do you think it might help in contemporary political economic discussions if Western participants were more understanding of non-Western traditions? And then I just have one very specific question from Akbar Noman. And he says, one impressive non-Western social scientist in the 14th century is Ibn Khaldun. I don't remember
Ibn
him in the
Khaldun.
book,
Mhm.
but if you can say anything about Khaldun, if you know.
Can you just tell me I forgot to write down the question before the Ibn Khaldun one.
Rebecca Ray.
Right.
How
How can we use? Yes,
do you
and-
think it might help
right.
contemporary political economic
Right.
discussions if Western participants were more understanding of non-Western traditions?
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to go in reverse order since that one's so fresh. So Ibn Khaldun is a very interesting figure. He's writing 14th century, and it's a good reminder that political economy did not begin with Adam Smith. And I begin the book with Adam Smith and it might seem a bit strange to some of you because it's an attempt to move beyond European thinkers. But I think Adam Smith was the first political economist who was known globally. And so that's why I actually think you have to begin with him if you're trying to tell a global history of kind of political economy diffusing around the world. But there are many people who, when they read Adam Smith around the world, say, "Oh, we had a thinker like that in our region already." And that's what happened in North Africa and much of the Middle East. They would refer to Ibn Khaldun because Ibn Khaldun wrote very sophisticated things about economics, and including kind of ideas about the way markets operate. And so there are many thinkers, say in the Ottoman Empire, which translates Smith. Smith becomes very popular in the Ottoman Empire in kind of mid-19th century, and a lot of thinkers are saying this is building on Ibn Khaldun's ideas, making them more sophisticated. So, and it's also true, I should say, for those of you interested in East Asian thought, that many people in East Asia, when they read about a mercantilist or neo-mercantilist ideas from Europe, would say, "Oh, that reminds us of Lord Shang from the 3rd century BC, who had this idea about power and wealth and the state should be active." Or some South Asian thinkers in 1910s or so, when they're reading, again, in this case, mercantilists thought, "Oh, this reminds us of the Arthashastra, which was actually the very first work of political economy," they would often say, around the same time as the book of Lord Shang. And so many places around the world would draw on pre-Smithian ideas to say political economy itself was not born in Europe, but rather had these roots elsewhere. So I'm glad I was asked about this. How should Western people use this? I mean, I can only speak personally, so everyone has to interpret history in their own personal way. I just find it very useful to be able to understand what Xi Jinping means when he cites Sun Yat-sen's 1920 book called The International Development of China. And I didn't know that book, whatever, 10 years ago. Now I know the book, and I know when he makes a speech and refers to it, I know exactly what he's referring to. I also know what he's not saying, because often he'll quote some passages and not other passages. And it's sometimes just as significant to know what's being left out. So I think Western scholars, can interpret the world better if they're understanding the references that are being made. So it's a kind of a basic point, but I think it's an important one. Why 1945? This is an interesting question. So in my case, the book actually stops in 1944. And I stop in 1944 because of the Bretton Woods Conference. And so the final chapter of the book is essentially saying, how did all of this history come together in the debates around constructing the post-war world economy? And what's, I think, absolutely fascinating about that moment is that the Bretton Woods people are aware of a lot of this history. And so it's, Sun Yat-sen's being quoted, by the Chinese delegation in their opening press conference, for example. There's an Indian delegation, even though India is not independent yet. It had a delegation at the conference, which was half British officials and half Indian officials. And they're invoking, some of this early Indian economic thought, kind of critiques of free trade as a defense of why the Bretton Woods system has to allow ISI. And so it's fascinating. What was not at the Bretton Woods conference, interestingly, was any Pan-African voices, any Pan-Asian voices. The kind of Islamic economics movement, which I give some time to in the book, also was not represented at the conference, although there were delegations from the Middle East. They didn't raise these issues. And also, there was no discussion, and I looked very carefully for any discussion of gender or environmental issues, completely absent from the Bretton Woods Conference. But they were not absent from time. So if I can just, if it's okay just to mention this, because it's a really interesting point. The 6 weeks before the Bretton Woods Conference begins, there's a conference that the ILO held about the post-war world economy, where they issued something called the Philadelphia Declaration, which is very famous to people who are in labor studies. And the Philadelphia Declaration said, any planning for the post-war international financial order, meaning the Bretton Woods Conference is coming up in 6 weeks' time, should give consideration to gender equality issues. Gender equality should be infused into the constitution of the Bretton Woods system. And that was just ignored at the Bretton Woods Conference. But it's not like people weren't thinking about it. And similarly, when it comes to environmental issues, just to give you one of many examples, one of the best, like a very best-selling book in Britain in 1943, 1944, was a book called The Living Soil, which Eve Balfour of the famous British Balfour family published, which was an environmental critique of rebuilding an open world economy. And there was even a 10-part BBC series being done at the time. So it's not like there weren't environmental ideas at the time, they just didn't make it to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Okay, let me just say the last two questions quickly. I love this question about mashup because I try to speak to it very briefly at the beginning of the book, which is almost speaking to students to say, you don't need to be a member of one of these clubs. You don't have to be a liberal or whatever it is, because a lot of these thinkers, as you're giving these examples, are mashing stuff together. And so just to go back to Sun Yat-sen, because he's a really big masher, Sun Yat-sen mixes Pan-Asian thinking with neo-mercantilist thinking, with some ideas, kind of tributary ideas. I mean, it's all over the place. Some thinkers also change their mind hugely. So, Keynes is a classical liberal. Then in the 1930s, he becomes, he writes his 1933 national self-sufficiency piece. And then he's the leader thinking at the Bretton Woods conference. So the point is people can mash stuff, they can change their minds, so I really hope people take that from the book. So that goes to your final point, which is what do you do with all this stuff? And I really don't want to say what you should do with this book. I can only tell you what I found interesting about this. What I found interesting is, as you, I think, you share my view that we're living at a moment of deep contestation. I think Kevin referred to this in the opening comments. And if I had published this book probably 20 years ago, I think the reaction might have been what you were sort of hinting at, which is, oh, there isn't that much contestation. Now there's a deep contestation. I think people need to understand the range of debate, which is already we're seeing, but which, you know, has these deep roots. So often people are drawing on ideas from 200 years ago or 100 years ago, and we need to understand those a little bit better than we have been, because it is a moment of deep contestation.
Thanks. One more burning or reception? That looks like a vote for reception. Hey, this is a terrific book. We really only were able to scrape into it. There's a lot here. There's a lot of people we need to learn about, not just for the sake of history, as he says, but as our friend in the back says, because we have a lot to try to make sense of right now and to try to make better. So thanks so much, Eric, for coming here. Thanks all of you for coming. We have a light reception over here. We can get to meet the author and chat. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.